Because over time in class, I'll have conversations with students, and I'll go, oh, that reminds me of this book that I'm reading, or oh, I really love this book. You guys should read this book. And they're like, yeah, with all the free time I have. And then I go, well, I'm reading it. You know that I'm busy. And they're like, yeah, but you're a teacher. And all those kinds of things. But I think a lot of times what happens is sometimes it's just out of sight, out of mind. And so I mentioned it in class. I was telling some students this morning. I'll mention a book on philosophy in our literature class, and I'll mention a book on history in our worldview class, and I'll mention it never seems to be related to that class directly. And so I go, even if they wrote down the title of all the books that I've recommended, it would be in 7 different notebooks over the course of a few years. So I thought, I am going to collect all of these things in one place. And then I always get to that moment, I'm like, well, it takes a long time. So when I decided to go ahead and add this workshop and offer it, I just have to be honest, part of it was I really want to help out people who are saying, I love reading, I love classical education, but sometimes I just get overwhelmed by the amount of stuff to read and I don't know where to start. I hope this will help you. I also wanted this workshop to be an opportunity for you to hear about our friends at 8th Day Books, and I'll call Josh up here in just a little bit, and he's going to share a little bit about their vision. And I want you to know that they don't just sell books, but there's more to what they do, and I think it'd be helpful for you to be aware of that. Plus, they sell books and you should buy them. And so this is a great way to recommend some books that you could go buy, or books like it, because we'll be talking about them. But selfishly, it really forced me to put this thing together, as I've promised myself that I wanted to do for students for a long time. And so it's a little bit of an eclectic kind of workshop, but I feel like classical Christian education lends itself that kind of hodgepodgery. In fact, Dr. Mack's doing one, I think at this very moment, over in the lower school that Mr. Mosley, our Latin teacher, gave a name for Farrago, and he said, it's like a confused mixture, a hodgepodge, a potpourri, if you will. And I was like, I'll do the same thing, but book-related. And so we've got a lot of hodgepodgery going on today. But I think that it appeals to probably most or all of you, or you just really enjoyed lunch and didn't really want to walk anywhere, and you're stuck with me. And that's fine as well. So I do want to pray, and then I'll call Josh up to start, and then take you through kind of what strange vision is in my head, and I hope that you enjoy it and are blessed and benefited by it. So let's pray. Father, I'm so grateful for this conference where we can gather in this place from all the different schools and homes and cities that we come from. And I'm just so grateful for the relationships that I've built this week, for those that, I say this week like today, that we've built over the years, friends that I didn't see last year because of COVID, that feels like we've known each other for decades, and really it's been a 2-day conference a few different years, and just the depth of relationship that happens in this place is so valuable. And so I pray that this workshop and the rest of this conference will be a blessing to the attendees, and God, that you'll be glorified through this week. And it's in Jesus' name we pray. Amen. Josh, why don't you come on up? And would you prefer to move around or stand? Okay? I don't know if you're a mover and a shaker. You're not a mover and a shaker. You're a standing in place.
I'm going to freeze right here. My name is Joshua Sturgeon. I've been working for 8th Day Books on and off for about 20 years. I keep moving away from Wichita, Kansas, where the bookstore is located, and then moving back or doing trips like this in the summers or spring. The owner is a longtime friend, and I feel like I'm a member of a community that has kind of been around the bookstore for a long time. We've started very small in an old house, and we're still fairly small, but a little bigger in a slightly larger house across town. If you've never been to Wichita, but you're coming up by 35, I encourage you to stop in. It's a beautiful place to be just for a moment. I remember reading a statistic or a bit of research in a psychological journal, education journal, a while back that said one of the #1 indicators of children becoming adults who read is not, as you would expect, being read to. That was high on the list. But the highest indicator was having a variety of books in the home. So that was the #1 indicator. And when my friend Warren started 8th Day Books several years ago, his idea was to have a bookstore that was stocked from a Christian worldview, but that contained every book that was important to the history of the Western world, whether we liked it or not. So when you come into 8th Day Books, you see that it definitely has a Christian presence. There's a huge patristics section with the early church fathers, but you can also get Mein Kampf there. There's a lot about world religions, not just what Christians think of them, but the actual texts of world religions, the Quran and the Bhagavad Gita, different books, so that people who are searching can sit and read in a Christian environment, but encounter important texts, again, whether we like them or not, because they're important. We want people to read Mein Kampf and the Communist Manifesto. We want these books to be read and discussed. We also want St. Athanasius to be read and discussed. We want The Wind in the Willows to be read and discussed. So we want all these books to be present, and what makes 8th Day Books work over time, when many other little independent bookstores have shut down, is the quality of the community around us that's kind of expanded. A few years ago, one of our former employees, still a good friend, started a nonprofit called the 8th Day Institute to do conferences, symposia, reading groups. We have pastors groups that come and meet at the store, like before opening hours. We freely hand out keys to the back door to any reading group that wants to come. And we want to sponsor dialogue among different Christian groups, among different educational groups. And it's that community base more than any kind of a business model or literacy in the population that has really kept us surviving and also thriving as the years go by. So 8thdaybooks.com, you're welcome to come and browse there, but there's only about 4 employees at any time, and somebody's always near the phone. So we get calls for all kinds of questions, even people just wanting to know what good books they should read that day, or looking at a book on their shelf and calling us and saying, what is this book that I have in my hand? Can you tell me more about it? So it's a great place to work, but I would encourage you, wherever you're from, go to your local bookstore and tell them what they should have on the shelf, and patronize the local booksellers. It's a dying art, selling books independently. So thank you.
So I have to confess that we don't have a lot of good independent bookstores around here, and so I frequent Amazon.com for books. But when Josh comes, I spend way more money than I should on way more books that I cannot read because I believe in what they do and it's helpful to them. So I encourage you to spend more money than you have on more books than you can read. And the more we all do that, the more Josh and the crew at 8th Day Books want to come back next year and continue to provide us with great resources. And so part of my story is really that I loved reading as a child. And I hit a point in kind of 9th and 10th grade where I was not a big fan of the high school that I went to. Did not enjoy my experience there. And so I just kind of stopped reading. I stopped doing the things that were kind of good for my soul. And it was around my junior year, pretty early on, when I got into a literature class with a teacher who actually really cared about students and really loved literature. And I sat down in that class and everything transformed for me. And I began reading again for fun. I began reading everything I could get my hands on. And when I found myself in college, I was asking, like, what should I major in? And I still had this idea that I should do something like really useful and practical. And I'm not saying that nobody should ever be a business major and do accounting, but I should not have been that person. But I tried it, and I hated it. And so then I moved on to journalism because I thought, well, I like to write, that would be a good thing. And I hated that too. And finally, I just said, you know what, you can't do anything with an English major, but at least I'll enjoy it. And so I did that, and it was an unbelievable experience for me in college. I try to convince all of my students to go to college and be English majors because it makes them better people. And so ever since that time, I've just read. It's just what I do. I love it. It's a hobby. People ask, like, how do you read so many books? You must read fast. And I just say, no, I'm just a relentless reader. Just read all the time. And some of my colleagues are here and can say that maybe I'm a little antisocial at times because at basketball games during timeouts, I'm reading a book. I always bring a book everywhere I go, and that's just kind of part of my story. And so over the years, I think there's just some stories about books that just resonated with me, that made sense. And what was fascinating is that I did a Master's of Divinity at Southwestern Seminary, and I never read Augustine's Confessions. I got an entire master's degree at a seminary and never had to read Augustine's Confessions, and I thought, this is absolutely insane. And so along the way, afterwards, I decided to read it on my own, and I came to find what all I was missing. Well, of course, if I didn't read Augustine's Confessions, had definitely not read Athanasius's On the Incarnation, and so I picked it up one time several years ago, many years ago now, and began reading it and was just overwhelmed by the depth of insight into the biblical text, the care and concern with which Athanasius was trying to tell the story of why God became man. Why would he die? And the word that stuck with me in that book was fittingness. The story of fittingness, that it would be unfitting for God to do certain things. And it was fitting for him to send his son to become human and to die on a cross. And certain deaths were unfitting for him, but death on a cross was the most fitting. And just as this began to open up to me, I began to see just the beauty of the way that the early church read the scriptures, and began to be engrossed in this book and enamored with this book to the point where I'd probably call Athanasius on the Incarnation my favorite book outside of the Bible. And so I began in that time thinking about all of the great books that we're supposed to read and how nobody could possibly read all of them. Although I know some people that I think are pretty close. And so with the help of Scott, we've had the opportunity to run this conference for several years now. I continue to have conversations with people, and I sit in sessions with people, and it's like, there's so much to read, where do I start? And my students obviously feel the same thing to an even greater degree than I'm sure that you do. And so I put this together, and I just wanted to tell you a few stories of some of the different books on this list and why they're on the list. And then open it up for you, and then just kind of talk about the role of books, not only in learning, but also in spiritual formation. And so if you want to turn to the side that says Great Books, Theology there in the top left, I mentioned Athanasius On the Incarnation there, as well as Confessions. And you can see those. And so as someone who has studied theology and biblical studies a lot, I'm going to totally skip that category because that's what you're supposed to do. But as I was finishing seminary, I found myself, because I was reading so much in school and reading for fun, I found that a lot of times I was reading for fun books like Kevin Van Hooser's Is There a Meaning in This Text?, in which he was dealing with really difficult issues of deconstruction and Jacques Derrida, and I found myself reading that for fun on top of all the things that I was doing. And I got to the point where my brain was so oversaturated with ideas, and I was so stressed out that I realized I needed to do something else. And so a friend of mine said, I just started reading poetry again. I was like, oh, I used to love poetry. Whatever happened? And so I picked up John Donne, and we read some John Donne, not together, but simultaneously in our own homes, and would occasionally talk about some of the different poems we were reading. And soon after that, he picked up a book by a guy named G.K. Chesterton, who I didn't know a whole lot about at that time, but he was reading The Man Who Was Thursday. And so I asked him what he thought of it, and he said, that's pretty good. And so I picked it up and I read it, and I was overwhelmed by that book. I couldn't understand, first of all, what had just happened. And so I started back at page 1 the moment I finished, and I started reading it again. And the moment I started rereading it, I realized he had told me everything and I completely missed it. And I think I've read that book probably, I don't know the word to use here, because if I say only, you'll think this is ridiculous, and if I say like it's a lot, some of you have read books more than this, but I think I've read it 6 times. I just dropped the adjective entirely. Only or as many as 6 times. And I've taught it a number of years with students, and I find it to be this book that I continue to come back to, because in a way that very few other books have done, it speaks to me about the issue of suffering in our world, and the experience of suffering, and what it looks like to feel completely alone in a world that is against you. And at this amazing moment, trying not to ruin the book at all, I think that the message of the story leads us back to the realization that God has not asked us to do anything, to endure any suffering that he was not willing to endure himself in the incarnation. And so when I read a book like Athanasius's and a book like G.K. Chesterton's, I realize that what God has done is, even though he asks us to endure suffering, and we struggle through the suffering, we know we're learning lessons, but we ask, why is this so hard? Why do we have to endure this? That he's never once asked us to do something that he wasn't willing to step into our world and do himself. And I learned that through literature, through a 150-page novel by G.K. Chesterton that seemingly makes absolutely no sense when you finish it the first 3 times. And so that's been one of those transformative books for me. And what that embarked me upon was the reminder that I needed to be reading fiction. I love nonfiction. I love books of theology. I love those deep, thoughtful, argumentative books. But I was reminded once again that I needed to feed my soul with stories. And so a lot of what you'll find on my list here are modern novels. I cheated with Manny with Sturgeon. I don't know where to put that, right? It's 1908, so that's 114 years ago. It's in the modern world. I made the list. I can do whatever I want, right? So I put it on there, but books like The Wind in the Willows or Gilead by Marilyn Robinson. People had told me for 15 years I needed to read Gilead, and I just ignored them until I finally read it last year, and it was astounding. The way the story was told, and just added another writing project to my list of things that I want to do. But it's transformed my imagination in significant ways. Another book on that modern novel list that I want to just tell a quick story about. It is Jayber Crow by Wendell Berry. And I can't remember who, when, why I finally decided to pick up Wendell Berry, but when I did, I was angry at everyone in the world for not making me do it much sooner. Because every single thing that came out of his pen, and I say pen because he talks about how he longhand writes everything, and then his wife would type it. Actually, Kevin talked about it this morning, why I'm not going to buy a computer. The reason he got really lots of hate mail is he talks about how his wife would then type it up, and they thought he was treating his wife like a slave. And he said, have you ever thought to consider that my wife actually enjoys typing and likes reading what I write? Obviously, you guys don't. And Feminism, the Body and the Machine is maybe one of the top 5 essays I've ever read. It's so good. So Kevin mentioned it, and I second that. It's fantastic. But I never really read Wendell Berry's fiction after having read a good bit of his essays and some of his poetry. And so I picked up Jayber Crow because I'm pretty sure it's the longest novel he wrote, so that seemed like a good idea at the time. And I found myself transported to the world of Port William that I did not expect. It was a time before the kind of world that I grew up in, and it's a story of kind of a dying way of life. Yeah, it's about a barber, and those guys are fun, but it's a story about a kind of dying way of life, the way that America and its people was changing. But I remember this book particularly because I think one of the things that appeals to me about books and about stories is that they don't happen in a vacuum. And so I was reading this book, and I was very near the end, and I was really excited. This sounds terrible, but it was the month of November previous year, and we had shut down for COVID. We had a number of different cases, and things were going on, and so we shut down in the beginning, I think November 3rd, and we were going to be out out until Thanksgiving. And so I had kind of this unexpected time off to read. So I was excited to be reading. And as I was preparing, the next day to finish the last 50 pages of the book, I got some really, really awful news. That a really, really close friend of mine from seminary, in fact, a guy that I had done a book group with over a book Andrew and I were just talking about, that he and his wife had been killed in a car accident. And it was just, it's that shocking moment when you're like, he's not even 40, what do you do with this? It's just overwhelming grief. And I sat down after hearing that, and I read the last 50 pages of Jaber Crow, and I wept through the entire thing. Because even though Jaber Crow had really nothing to do with my life, or so I thought, it spoke to me in really, really powerful ways. And it helped me grieve. And as I watched Jaber Crow grieve over the loss of someone close to him, over the loss of a way of life, over the way things were changing in the world, I found myself healing before I ever had a chance to go down to the funeral. And so, just the transformative spiritual power of stories to transform us as people, to speak to our deepest griefs, has been one of the greatest joys of my life. And so, on the other side of the modern novels there is what I call Christian living. And I have a book there called God of the Garden by Andrew Peterson. And you can just write next to that the book Adorning the Dark. Adorning the Dark is a book about writing, kind of. Because nothing that Andrew Peterson does is just one thing. He's an artist. Musically, he's a really great pencil sketch artist. He writes fiction. The Wingfeather Saga is one of my favorite series on the backside of this paper. An incredible musician and songwriter. So nothing he does is just one thing. But he wrote this book called Adorning the Dark. And I found myself reading that book during just a time of incredible, tumultuous change in our life a couple years ago. And I didn't really know what was going on in our life, except that I was sitting on the porch reading this book, and he's talking about how we cling to things in life, but are we willing to let the Holy Spirit blow us where God is? And I was like, I want to say yes, but I don't know if that's true. And I just felt like God was about to do something very different in our life, and I was terrified. I was a little excited, but I was mostly terrified. And God did something really, really different. And 2 years later, was frankly still struggling with it, and we don't really understand it. But that book was so important for me. It's a book about writing. It's what I thought I was reading, was a book about writing. And it was a book about the state of my soul in flux. Do you trust the Lord to send you wherever you're going to go? And having to work through that. And so last year when he published The God of the Garden, I was afraid to read it. I hadn't quite healed yet from the last thing, and so I wasn't sure I wanted to pick up another book by this guy. And he talked about trees, or so I thought it was about trees, but it was really about his story of depression and struggle and suffering. And he began to speak to me once again in ways that I this time at least, kind of anticipated, and began to realize there's immense and beautiful spiritual healing in books of all sorts, fiction, nonfiction, biography, autobiography. And so I can't go through every book on this list, obviously, but I'll just tell you 2 more stories really quickly. I think my favorite novel is Till We Have Faces by C.S. Lewis. I think my second, just because it got me kickstarted on my obsession with G.K. Chesterton, is The Man Who Was Thursday. But if I have to be really honest about which book I think is best written and has the deepest insight into the human condition, it's probably The Brothers Karamazov by Fyodor Dostoevsky. And it's kind of a funny story, so this one, I'm not going to cry in this one, I'm pretty sure. So Dostoevsky, the first time I encountered Dostoevsky was The Notes from the Underground, which is a strange kind of existential, bizarre book that I had to read in college during a class with one of my professors who got way into existentialism. So we were reading like Hermann Hesse and Jean-Paul Sartre. It was bizarre. It was a great class, but man, we were reading some dark and weird stuff. And so we read Dostoevsky's Notes from the Underground, and I'm like, this is just strange. I don't know what to think about this guy. But I kept hearing that he had written some of the greatest novels, in all of history. And so I thought, this might just be a strange anomaly. And honestly, it's a very good book. It's just a little dark and existentialist. And so I picked up, not Brothers Karamazov yet, Crime and Punishment. And I picked up Crime and Punishment, and about 80 pages into Crime and Punishment is the great crime. And then the next 20 pages I felt like was the punishment, because I didn't really enjoy the next 20 pages after that. Like everything built up to this moment, I was like, this is a 450-page book, and I'm only on page 80 through 100, and I'm like, bored now. But I didn't really understand it, so I put it down, and I was like, I'll pick it back up another time. So I did, 3 years later. I tried it again, and I got to the same point, and I quit at the same point. And then I tried it a third time, and I got to about page 75, and I was like, I know it's coming, and I know I'm not gonna like what's after it, and I quit. So I'm not usually a book quitter. In fact, really about the only books I've ever quit were that one, The Brothers Karamazov, Story Forthcoming, and The Sun Also Rises by Ernest Hemingway. That one stayed quick. I actually threw that book across the room and said I refuse to ever pick it up again. So if anyone's a big Ernest Hemingway, Sun Also Rises fan, I could be convinced to pick it up again, but it will take some work. So the moral of that story is I don't think you have to like every great book. Okay? You don't have to like them all, but there's a reason they're great and worth our time. And when I finally gave the time to Dostoevsky, I decided I was going to read The Brothers Karamazov because that one was supposedly better than Crime and Punishment, and it had the Grand Inquisitor, and it was perfect, and this is what I'm going to do. So I picked it up, and I read the first 250 pages, and I was charging ahead, and I got to the Grand Inquisitor, and I was like, yeah! And then I read it, and I was like, what? That's what all the fuss was about? And I gave up. And to be honest, I just completely didn't understand it, because I was in such a rush to get to there that I just completely missed the point of the book. Probably not the book to read right before you go to sleep, because you don't catch everything. So I just didn't understand, so I set that one down for years. And until this guy back here, Andrew, was part of a group of former students who decided that we were going to read The Brothers Karamazov as like a summer reading group kind of thing. And I ended up reading that book like 2 summers in a row in different groups. And it was so great. First of all, because I actually took time to understand it. Secondly, because it's just really a great book. And third, because we did it in community, which is a lesson that I've learned is so valuable, is to read books in community. And it became one of those books that I just realized has so much insight into the human condition. And I won't talk a whole lot more about it. I would love to talk about it. If you've read it and you want to talk about it, we can talk all day about it. But so I finally, this last year, decided that I was probably just not a good enough person. And so it was my fault, and so I picked up Crime and Punishment again. And I made my way through the whole book, and I'm really glad I did. It's not as good as The Brothers K, but it's a really good book. And I realized sometimes we just gotta let things simmer for a while. You gotta try it and try it. It's kind of like vegetables. People tell me at some point I will like vegetables. Still not there. Still on reading 3, apparently, of the Crime and Punishment. Maybe the next attempt at stewed vegetables will work. But it's one of those things that it's like, I know it's good for me, even if I don't like it. But maybe someday I will acquire the taste. And so sometimes it's just that you need to be reading it in community instead of alone. Sometimes it's that you need to put more time into it than you've given it, because it's worth the time. Sometimes it's just the circumstance in which you read it. Jayber Crow is a decidedly good novel. Just objectively good novel. If I had read it for the first time 8 years ago, I don't think I would have had the same experience of it. And that's okay. Sometimes the books that we love the most are because they speak to us in a particular season. And so these are just some of the things that were going on in my head, and for some reason I thought you'd want to hear them, and so I'm sharing them with you. But what I did create was this list of books that I love in various categories, and I would be happy to talk with you about any one of them. Oh, I was going to do one more. I'm sorry. What time? We're good. We're good. We're good. So it's actually cheating. There's two more, but it's kind of one story. So can I do two more with one story? Okay, cool. So under Christian living, there's a book called Pictures at a Theological Exhibition. Just a little like random tidbit about me in case there's ever a Jeopardy question about me and my reading habits. I hate and despise endnotes. Footnotes all day, every day. Because footnotes say, you should read this, they're right here on the page for you. Endnotes say, only just some absurd person will flip to the end of the book and check this out. And I don't actually want you to check it out. And then you're going to check it out and it's only going to say, like, I did 12. And you're like, what's the point? And then you're going to give up and you're going to miss the great content footnote that's back there. But if it was really that great, it should have been a footnote. So anyway, Pictures at a Theological Exhibition, as all good theology books should, uses footnotes. And in a random little commented footnote, Kevin Van Hooser in this book, which is a collection of speeches and essays he's done over time that talks about the Christian imagination and the most fitting thing to do in any circumstance. It's a phenomenal collection. But he has this one little moment where he talks about on the reduction of the arts to theology by St. Bonaventure. I was like, well, that sounds kind of interesting. So I bought the book online and I read Bonaventure and I became obsessed with Bonaventure. And so I spent the last 3 years reading Bonaventure and gave a conference presentation at a national theology convention 2 years ago, and then found out last month that an essay that I wrote on Bonaventure is going to get published at the end of the year. And I was like, all because of a footnote in Kevin Van Hooser's book. So if you read the footnotes, you'll publish essays. I think that's how it works. So I thought that was just kind of a funny story of how I ended up with Bonaventure from Kevin Van Hooser, who, if you were paying very close attention, wrote the book, Is There a Meaning in This Text? Which led me to G.K. Chesterton. Remember that? I was so overdone with Derrida that okay, one last story. When I was doing my PhD comprehensive exams, I got a question on hermeneutics about deconstruction, and all I did was just summarize everything that Van Hooser had taught me from that book. And I totally aced it. It was great. So those things did help for fun, but more than anything, it was just funny the way that that book led me to, I need to read fiction, but eventually I came back to Van Hooser and all his other stuff, and it led me to Bonaventure. And the lesson from all of this is to say, when we read, just follow the trail, right? If you read Andrew Peterson, he'll lead you to Eugene Peterson and 50 other people. If you read Eugene Peterson, he'll lead you to Wendell Berry and 50 other people. And if you read Wendell Berry, then you don't have to read anything else but the Bible. I think that's what I've determined. So anyway, I'm done talking and want to just kind of open it up. I thought we had a working microphone here. I think it's just muted, so I can pull this off. Maybe, hey, Gage, will you run and see if the one that says 2 is muted and if we can turn it on? Because that would be awesome. You know where this, maybe not. It's okay. You're good. I'll just keep doing this. It's not okay. How about this? There we go. All right. Maybe before I did all of that, does anybody want to share a book that's been impactful to you? Now you have to, because this is awkward if you don't. I'm totally cool with awkward. Yeah, Andrew.
So we grew up taking our kids to like every sporting event ever known to man, and they've never liked to read. And then we moved here when our oldest son was 16, and he had Kyle for class, and Amy, and people that are sharing all of these great books with them. And it's just amazing. And he was in Andrew's class, and it's just amazing to me how much he reads now because of what was put in front of him and how the people that he looked up to were impacted by those readings. And so I just think it's so interesting because it wasn't something mom or dad did, but how much of an impact that a teacher has that loves to read and shares that with his students or her students. And that's just really changed, his direct impression of his life. So I think that's really cool.
Thanks for sharing that. else want to?
Yeah, I just wanted to, when I was looking at this list, I went right to the novels and was very excited to see Dostoevsky on there. So in addition to in high school reading Lord of the Rings and The Hobbit, which was my first time reading actual literature through, I was in public school and whatever, but anyway, I read in high school, just on my own, I read Crime and Punishment and Brothers Karamazov, and it was amazing. I got a sense of the depth of understanding of the human condition, and I wasn't a believer. And, I got to tell you, those books were so deep, and I didn't really understand all of it, but I understood that there was a trail of steps toward mining the human heart and peeling back the onion of the human heart, deeper, that it was enlightening to me. And so I just wanted to share that with you. And then I wanted to ask you a question.
Okay.
In high school, I remember having a literature class. It was a good class. I learned a lot. But I also recognized a lot of the books that we read were fairly nihilistic. Hemingway, Old Man and the Sea, also like Catcher in the Rye, things like that. And why is that? Why are a lot of those books, they're like considered, these are things you're supposed to read. But I remember reading them and going, this is depressing. Like, why is that? And so I know that that's not where we go with classical literature and classical education, but it really is in high schools these days. I think it's this nihilistic literature. And that was when I was younger, and I got a lot of gray hair. So in these days, I can't imagine how nihilistic things are presented. What are your thoughts on that?
Yeah, I think that if we're completely honest, if we eliminate God, we're not completely honest, but if we eliminate God and then try to be completely honest about what hope we have in this universe, I think we come up with nihilism. Because there simply cannot be any hope apart from God. And when we explore the world, we see pain, suffering, just relentless forces working against us. And so I think there's something deeply true about those books in terms of the experience of the universe as it is when we eliminate God from the equation. And so, in some ways, it almost reminds me of like the book of Ecclesiastes, in which the reality is, if you seek meaning under the sun, you'll find nothing. But you need to get over the sun and see things that include the reality that God is sovereign over all things, and there is hope now and in the future in Christ. And so, I think the reason for that is people want to eliminate God because as soon as we allow God in the equation, I'm not my own God. I don't get to determine my own destiny. And people want to determine their own destiny. But I think there are many that thought deeply about that and realized that if I have to find my own purpose, I can't find one. And I find something, this sounds weird, but something refreshing in their honesty. So I actually really enjoy reading Jean-Paul Sartre, his play No Exit. He has one called The Wall, and they're very disturbing, but at the same time they're honest. And I remember reading and writing about Stephen Crane's short story The Open Boat, and it was much the same idea, that he kind of portrays this naturalistic universe in which God, if he were to exist, were entirely indifferent to us. And so you can see him wrestling with how do we explain things then, and you can't come to an answer. So, I guess, why do we see that kind of literature? Because there are honest people who don't believe in God and then realize this is all that's left for them. I think we read that literature because it's very well written, and it's exploring honestly the human condition. But the reason that we don't accept that literature as the height of literature is that it doesn't have the redemptive, hopeful message of A Brother's Karamazov. It doesn't end with the celebration of adoption. It doesn't end with a picture of the possibility of redemption. And so I think a lot of those books, especially a lot of the Russian novels that I have on here, like Anna Karenina, there's a darkness throughout, but there's infusions of hope and truth and goodness and beauty as well. So I find them compelling, and I find the Sartres of the world compelling. But I think you're right. To put that in the hands of a high school kid and to say, I don't believe in God or I can't talk about God, and to give them that book is to set them up for, frankly, madness.
Because there was no discussion, no context.
Yes.
Just basically, pulling out the literary devices, character development, all those kinds of aspects. But then in terms of the meaning, literally no context, no discussion.
Well,
so you're left there as a 15-year-old wrestling with that.
Yeah, and that's where I almost hope that kids are poor readers at that point. Because I don't mind if they get the literary devices and that kind of character development from those. If they miss the meaning, I'm like, good, because the meaning's bad. But I fear that sometimes maybe they get a lot more of that meaning than we think they do. And it's, I don't want to say dangerous, like that we shouldn't read those books, but it is if you just hand it to a kid without context and without commentary and without telling them that there's hope in Jesus. It's destructive. And I think we see a lot of problems in our world today, only one of which is that kind of nihilism. But I do think there are a lot of people that are depressed and hopeless, and they're searching for answers, and if they eliminate God from the possibilities, they're not going to find any. And that's where we move to despondency and despair. And there's not really anywhere to go after that.
Just as a quick aside, I also I fiddle around with Twitter a little bit, and there's several threads I kind of follow down on some discussions, and I'm finding, in fact, I'm having some conversation with people now who I would consider very left, but not, I would consider super woke progressive, but very left, who are, I would say, very disturbed by some things that have happened over the last couple of years, and they're starting to ask a lot of questions. And one specifically just the other day started saying, I wonder if a lot of what we're seeing is because people have left God out of their lives, including me. And those are the kind of conversations that I enter in and I ask additional questions, or I put some pieces of information out there. Oh, there might be something to this. Let's think about this or this. And it's interesting because I think it's these difficulties that we're going through are causing some people to have some questions, and those are great opportunities, and literature like this can even help as well. Anyway, that's just an aside because there's just a lot of people out there right now, I think, with everything going on, questioning some of their assumptions.
Yeah, and I'm glad they are. That provides us with an amazing opportunity to witness the hope that we have in Jesus. So we've got time for a couple more people if you want. And if you want to just start browsing the books, I'm not going to judge you for, I would never judge someone for getting up and looking at books. So I justified, and if someone wants to, raise your hand and he'll bring you the mic and I'll stop talking as soon as you grab the mic. But I was laughing one time because my students will come in my room and they'll, if you haven't seen my classroom, I'm in room 303. It's the one with like 14 bookshelves that are all full, and there's books on the floor, and I have books at my house, and I have books in another office elsewhere. It's a real problem. And I'm about to go buy more books from Josh over there. But they asked me, have you read all of these books? Like, no. And I never will. Like, then why do you own them? And I said, it's because every time I look at that bookshelf, I realize how much I don't know. And I think there's something to like owning 5 books and you've read them all twice that you can start to feel like, I kind of know a lot. But when you look at the bookshelf and you go, I haven't read 80% of this, there's like a humility that comes with going, I might know a lot, but look how much I don't know, and I want to know, and it just is a pursuit of lifelong learning. Because, like I just said, I read Van Hooser and it makes me want to go read Bonaventure, which makes me read the rest of Bonaventure, which leads me to who knows how many other things I've stumbled upon through that process. And so if we want our students to become lifelong learners, of course we want to be lifelong learners, and the best way to do that is to own books you won't read. So go buy more. But yeah, so that's what I tell my students. You should own books that you haven't read, and maybe not that you never plan to read, but that you just know that there's a good chance you'll never get to read. And that's okay. And then pass them down to your children, which is the second greatest inheritance after the faith that you're passing on to them. Pass on Jesus and a good book collection, and you've done your job as a parent. So, all right. I said I was going to be done talking. Andrew, thank you for saving me.
So, would you consider all three of your kids to be pretty avid readers?
No.
Really? Okay, so my question is...
And unfortunately, it was not passed down that way.
I just wondered what I don't want you to create another list, but if you were to say what you would like to expose your kids to at a young age
Yes.
to help with that, so they're not just reading things they probably shouldn't be reading,
Yeah.
but they're also, like we talked about, creating wonder and all of and inspiration and creativity.
Yes.
If you had a few of those that you could share with us.
Yeah, for sure. So on the modern novels there, your kids before high school are probably not ready for Till We Have Faces or The Man Who Was Thursday. Jayber Crow would be a little deal on them too. But Wind in the Willows, absolutely phenomenal. And it was told by Kenneth Grahame as stories to his children. And then he added a few more. It does get a little wild because, Frog is kind of a mischievous little guy and ends up in prison. And so, you got to talk about hard stuff to your kids if you read that. And then the Book of the Dun Cow is a retelling of Chanticleer the Rooster, and it's just a wonderful, wonderful story. That's another one that people told me to read for a long time, and I didn't listen to them. So, not that I'm saying you should listen to me, but I did learn a lot, and I finally listened to other people, so that's from them, not from me. But on the back, favorite series, I know some people have concerns about Harry Potter because of witchcraft, and that's a story that, I'll defend the Harry Potter books, but if that's you, then it's like, okay, then don't read those. But Lord of the Rings, including The Hobbit, I said, and The Silmarillion, don't read that to your kids. It's like the genealogy of elves. I wrote a paper on genealogies because I think they're fascinating, so that might not be the book for you or your kids. But Chronicles of Narnia, and the Wingfeather Saga by Andrew Peterson are great book series, and I like series because then you get more and more time with these characters. But those are great series to read with your kids, to have your kids read both, and because it opens up for them the idea of exploring other worlds. But as they explore Middle Earth, as they explore Erear and the Wingfeather Saga, as they explore Narnia, what they're really doing is they're exploring their own world. Because they can see truths in that world, but then they go, wait, that's like our world. And I think that's incredible. I would encourage your kids to read poetry. I wouldn't hand them everything by John Donne, but there's some good John Donne that they can read. There's some wonderful poetry out there. But I'm not opposed to nonfiction for kids for sure, but I just think stories and poetry for children are incredible and transformative, and get them excited about reading or knowing or asking questions. It's things they can repeat. They can tell, oh, we were reading this story, and they can repeat it more than, well, here's the 3-point argument of this philosophical text my dad read me last night. But yeah, those would be some things that I would definitely recommend. And then as they start to get older, I've just been really impressed by the depth but accessibility of like Eugene Peterson's series of books on spiritual theology. And C.S. Lewis, some of N.T. Wright, the more popular books, as they get into high school, those are more accessible to them, and they're just thought-provoking and rooted good scholarship. And, yeah. I also got totally obsessed with the Pickwick Papers last year. I studied in Copperfield, which I was kind of shocked by because I might have started the Pickwick Papers 8 years ago and read 70 pages and stopped. I was like, quit more books than I thought. But I came back to it. Except the sun also rises. I just can't get it. Yeah, so I came back to that one. I realized until you meet Samuel Weller in the Pickwick Papers, it's mediocre. After Samuel Weller, he's like the greatest character in British literature. So you just got to get to him, and it's worth every second. So, all right. Any other questions or comments? Ways books have transformed you? We have 7 minutes if we want, or we can go by books. Going once, going twice. Andrew.
I mean, I know for me recently, you and I just read, and I'd love to hear you talk about this. I'll mention some things about it. But The Love That Is God by Frederick Christian Bauerschmidt.
Yes.
There's a comment on the back of that book by Wesley Hill. It says that the book made him want to become a Christian all over again. And that was absolutely my experience. The simplicity with which he talks about the God of the gospel. It's so profound, yet it's so simple. And I mean, we finished our book club on that book about 2 weeks ago. Kyle and I are sitting in the teacher's lounge at SofO, both crying after reading the last 3 pages of that book.
I wish someone had walked in at that moment. Just been like, these 2 men weeping.
I think I laughed to you about how I cried when I read it by myself.
Yes.
Like, yeah, I cried earlier this week, and then I read the line and I just start crying again. But just the power of good theology doesn't have to be highly academic. It doesn't have to be heady. If it's good theology, it has the ability to just revitalize your faith, so that you can see the face of Christ.
Because what we're encountering is not an idea, but a person.
Right.
And I think that's what that book did. There's a lot of great theology books that help me understand ideas, and that's valuable.
Yeah.
But what that book does is it helps you re-encounter the tri-personal God. And you go,
It's The Love That Is God. It's in Modern Theology, number 4. For high schoolers, like if you're in a ministry setting, that it's just has about 5 chapters. And each chapter is just so profound. I would highly recommend it. Yeah.
I noticed you have several Malcolm Gladwell on there. I've read The Tipping Point.
Yeah.
But I see you have him several times. But why, what's your reasoning that you like him so much?
yeah, so that was another story that popped up where, so one way we tried to do the reading group one time is Dr. Mack, that you've met already, and 2 of our former students, Jacob and Christian, we all decided we were going to read Outliers, but we bought 1 copy, and the first person read it and made their notes and gave it to the second person, and they read it and took their notes, and I got it third and read it and took my notes, and then I gave it to he who shall not be named, and he held on to it for a year and a half and didn't read it. It was not Dr. Mack, it was one of the former students. So anyway, Andrew already knows which of the 2 former students wouldn't have read it. So anyway, I think he did eventually read it, but I don't know that the book ever got returned to Dr. Mack's office for us to have as a memento of all of our thoughts about it. But I had heard about that book for a long time and finally read it, and I was just like, I just love the way that he integrates history, social science. He's open to God and theism, and just like he's a very open-minded and thoughtful individual, and an incredible storyteller. So it's not fiction, but he just tells these compelling stories. And so I read it, and so I was like, well, I'm going to read this new book. At the time, Talking with Strangers had just come out. And I was like, this is fantastic, because it talks about how we think we know people just by like quickly meeting them, and we completely miss the point. And one of his illustrations is like, we think that the more we get to know them, we'll know them better. And I'm not explaining this well anyway, but he talks about how it was possible that so many world leaders just misunderstood and didn't realize the threat that Adolf Hitler posed. They sat down across the table from him and were convinced that he was not going to do the things that he then subsequently did. And so he talks about people that are kind of like asynchronous or whatever, but basically the idea of they seem evil, but they're actually good, or they seem good and telling the truth, but they're actually people and lying. And there are some people that are just mismatched that way. And so I just got really fascinated by that. I was like, wow, this is really interesting. I'm going to try this book, Blink, and I read Blink right after that. And it was about like snap judgments, and I was like, this is really intriguing. So then I read David and Goliath, and it was good too. And then I read The Tipping Point. So I read like 5 Malcolm Gladwell books in the span of like 4 or 5 months because I just got obsessed with him. And I don't apologize for it, and I don't regret it. I didn't put David and Goliath on here only because it didn't really fit. It's the worst of the group, but it's like not worse, it's good. So anyway, I just thought I'll just throw random notable modern books on there, like things that you might be interested in for no reason whatsoever. And Malcolm Gladwell, as I started thinking through the list, is like, well, that one, and this is gonna look weird, but here we go. So he has a podcast called Revisionist History. It's so good. And so anyway, I'm a fanboy, as they like to say these days. I don't agree with everything he says, but I don't agree with everything that I say. I tell my students that I've never agreed with an author 100%, including when I read my own things. If you wait 3 weeks, I'll change my mind. Hopefully in a good way, just because I'm always trying to learn. Those 2 Thomas Cahill books are really, really good. And then I stumbled across this E.H. Gombrich book, Little History of the World. He's an art historian, but he just, in 200 pages, tells the story from, early civilization to, early 1900s in the most compelling way possible. I just thought, this is so good, because it just eliminates all the excurses that I got in other history books and the silly, here's the story, and I just found it really good, so I put it in there. So there you go. It's probably no one you want. I like Malcolm Gladwell at the end. All right, well, our time is up. I still encourage you to go buy books, but thanks for spending some time book talking with me. So, hope you enjoy the rest of the conference.